Hello and welcome to the Director's Office Grants Management Unit's Request for Reimbursement webinar. In this webinar, you will learn how to use the appropriate templates to submit a request for reimbursement, also referred to as an RFR. This webinar will include the general documentation, template requirements, and whom to contact with any questions you may have. The required templates used to submit a request for reimbursement are contained within the RFR Workbook. A workbook will be sent to the contact person listed on the Notice of Subaward document for each subrecipient by the program manager via email, along with the RFR Workbook instruction manual. The workbook contains several sheets that are individually named on the tabs that run along the bottom. As we move along in this webinar, the tab being discussed will appear at the top of the PowerPoint slide. Detailed instructions for all forms to be discussed in this webinar are contained in the RFR Workbook instruction manual. It is suggested at the start of each monthly request for reimbursement to save the workbook using Save As and naming the saved file the agency reference DO number, agency name and month and year being requested. The agency reference DO number can be found in the upper right-hand corner of the Notice of Subaward document. In this slide, you can see RFR Workbook saved for July, August, and September, with a new one being saved for October. The RFR Workbook contains a tab labeled Instructions, which provide a quick reference for the information needed in each tab. The request for reimbursement form will be the cover sheet for the request for reimbursement RFR. It must contain a snapshot of the subgrant reimbursements and expenditures for the month submitted. This information must match the year-to-date form as well as the transaction list and source documentation form upon submission. The page must be signed and dated by an authorized individual of the organization and submitted together with all required documents to gmu@dhhs.nv.gov. When digitally signing the request for reimbursement page, please do not check the lock document after signing box, as further approval signatures will need to be added. In the past, requests for reimbursement have been submitted absent of the entire package or have had handwritten adjustments. Due to compliance requirements, the Grants Management Unit will no longer be able to accept RFRs which are not signed, have incorrect information, or are missing forms. The Grants Management Unit is unable to make adjustments or exceptions. RFRs will be rejected for necessary corrections and resubmission. Please be meticulous and detailed when compiling these requests so reimbursements are not delayed. Each expenditure captured on a request for reimbursement must have occurred during the subgrant period contained within the subgrant award. The expense must be allocable to the subgrant, meaning the subgrant received a benefit from the expense. It must be allowable, meaning it is permitted in the subgrant scope of work, the budget narrative, and any applicable federal or state guidelines, and it must be a reasonable expense. An expenditure listed in the RFR cannot be requested in any other request for reimbursement to any other type of funding in the state of Nevada, unless the expenditure is funded by multiple sources. In that case, cost allocation must be shown on the transaction list and source documentation form, which will be discussed later in this webinar. The expenditure must be the net of all applicable credits. Additionally, the subrecipient must maintain all supporting source documents for the expenditure being requested and make them available upon request at the time of the RFR submission, during a site visit or an audit, whether that be an audit or monitoring of the state agency or the subgrantee organization. Upon receipt of the initial RFR workbook, the information in red must be updated to reflect the specific program. If the agency has more than one subgrant with the grants management unit, a workbook must be completed for each subgrant award. The information needed to complete the fields in red can be found on the Notice of Subaward document. The information in the upper right-hand corner is very important and must match the information on the Notice of Subaward. It is also important to update the draw number with each RFR submitted. The information in red on this page should not change throughout the subgrant period, excluding the draw number, month, and year being requested. The approved budget amounts must be reflective of the categories and amounts in place for the time period being requested for reimbursement. Once updated, the subrecipient will need to change the font color to black. If an amendment or budget modification is completed during the award period, the subgrantee will change the information in box A, approved budget, to the revised amount for each category on the request for reimbursement for the month following the amendment or budget modification. Each month, the subrecipient will compile associated expenditures incurred within that month and request them for reimbursement. The subrecipient will organize the expenditures on the transaction list and source documentation form and year-to-date form and enter the totals into the appropriate categories in box C, current request, on the request for reimbursement form. Keep in mind these numbers should all match the year-to-date form and transaction list and source documentation form, which will be discussed over the next few slides. Before entering the current request amounts, see the information on the next slide regarding box B, total prior requests. If the formulas have not been changed, boxes D, E, and F will calculate according to the information contained in boxes A, B, and C. Box C, current request, may contain negative numbers seen when a credit is being provided to the subgrant. However, negative numbers in boxes E and F are not permitted for reimbursement purposes. If this occurs, the subrecipient must contact the program manager to discuss remedies for the particular scenario and whether or not there are any available solutions, as this is indicative of expenses being incurred without proper authority in place. In these two examples, we see the months being updated as the subgrant year progresses. The full examples in RFR Workbook Instruction Manual can be accessed via the link to the Grants Management Unit website. In the July example, to the left, box B, total prior requests, is 0, as this is the first reimbursement request for this subgrant period. Box C, current request, shows the current month's request amounts. Box D, year-to-date, box E, budget balance, and box F, percent expended, have auto-calculated. In the August example to the right, the amounts from the July RFR, box D, year-to-date column, have been entered into box B, total prior requests. The current month's request amounts have been entered into box C, current request. Box D, year-to-date, box E, budget balance, and box F, percent expended, have auto-calculated. It is recommended not to remove or change formulas in this form. Detailed instructions for all forms are contained in the RFR Workbook Instruction Manual. I am hopeful you can begin to see the benefit in using the Save As function for each month's reimbursement request. Moving on to the Year-to-Date tab, this form is required as part of the RFR submission and is made up of 2 sections. The top section, Section 1, provides a summary of the entire year's expenditures for the subgrant. Section 1 for the month of September is shown on this slide. The budget column circled in red will auto-populate when the reimbursement request form has had the approved budget amounts entered in box A, approved budget. If the formulas are removed from this section, the budget column will need to be updated using the amounts in the approved subgrant award. The information in Section 1 for each month, circled in green, auto-calculates from the information entered in Section 2 by the subrecipient. Information in Section 1 should never be entered manually, as it removes the formulas and will result in incorrect entries going forward. The months indicated at the top of the form, July through June, must match the periods specified in the subgrant award. As an example, if the subgrant award period begins October 1st, the months will begin with October and continue through the end of the subgrant period. This slide contains Section 2, located on the lower portion of the year-to-date form. The September RFR example is shown. Upon creating the initial workbook, please populate the budget column circled in red with the information from each of the subgrant individual categories and subcategories within the budget narrative. As an example, the travel category has one subcategory, per rump mileage. The other category has two subcategories, cellular communications and bottle exchange. Each subcategory in other has an individual budget which add up to the overall category total of $600. Change the red text to black after inserting information. Detailed expenses are entered manually by the subrecipient each month into appropriate subcategories circled in blue. The numbers are sourced from the transaction list and source documentation form and must match. The far right three columns circled in green contain the year-to-date expenditures, percentage of spend down, and remaining balances. The column containing the percentage of spend down should not exceed 100%. If this occurs, the subrecipient must contact the program manager to discuss remedies for the particular scenario and whether or not there are any available solutions, as this is indicative of the expenses being incurred without proper authority in place. If the subrecipient has opened the previous month's RFR and saved using the Save As feature for the current month, it is only necessary to populate the information for the month submitted for reimbursement. In this slide, the information for September was entered. The information for July and August was already there from the previous month's RFRs. Information for previous month's RFRs should not change. Note, it may be necessary to add subcategory rows. In this case, it will be necessary to copy or complete the formulas on the far right, as the new rows will not contain formulas. Detailed instructions for all forms are contained in the RFR Workbook Instruction Manual. The transaction list and source documentation form is a required component of the request for reimbursement and provides a list of the individual expenditures within the grant. If the expenditure is a shared expense across multiple funding sources, the funding sources and percentages allocated will be indicated in the appropriate columns. When an expenditure is listed on the transaction list, the subrecipient is ensuring that all source documentation, invoices, checks, time cards, etc., are being maintained within their organization and will be available upon request for inspection and review. This slide shows the transaction list and source documentation form for the month of September. The form contains very detailed information for each expense being requested for reimbursement. This form must be submitted with the organization's request for reimbursement and must be completed in its entirety. As an example, in the personnel category, by listing the check date, check number, payee or vendor information, description of expense, and total cost of the expense, the grants management unit is able to confirm the subrecipient has paid the invoice or bill for the reimbursements being requested. The transaction list will be used to provide information about how the cost is being allocated within the subrecipient's organization. This allows for confirmation that the subrecipient is not requesting the expense from more than one source, or if the expense is being requested from more than one source, the subrecipient will identify the sources on this form and how much is being allocated to each funding source. This helps determine how much benefit the grant can be expected to have received from that expense. The first red arrow shows the total for personnel, which includes who was paid, what percentage of their pay was charged to the subgrant. We see that 100% of Lucy Lou's time is charged to the CSBG grant, see in the yellow column. This means Lucy Lou worked 100% on the activities within the scope of work of the subgrant. The second red arrow tells a little bit different story. The cellular phone charge for Lucy Lou costs a total of $50, but the CSBG subgrant from the grants management unit is only paying 47% of the charge, again seen in the yellow column. Another funding source is paying the remainder. Funding sources indicated at the top of each column titled percent charge to funding source, circled in blue, must be entered by the subrecipient to define all sources of funding. Percentages each funding source must be updated by the subrecipient according to the actuals of how expenses are allocated within their organization and cannot be a guesstimate. In this example, we see the remainder of the cellular charge was allocated to general fund, circled in red. The total cost allocation column must equal 100%, no more, no less, circled in green. The last expense, wastewater LLC, totals $200 and has been cost allocated across 3 sources of funding as an additional funding source. Water for tots has been added. If the formulas are not changed within this tab, the percentage entered in the yellow column, which is the column that depicts what is allocated to the grant being requested for reimbursement, will auto-calculate the total cost for the RFR in the column labeled Amount Charged to Grant, circled in purple. Many subrecipients will start their monthly request with a transaction list form, then copy the subcategory numbers to the year-to-date form, and then finally copy the category totals to the reimbursement request form. This is a good way to ensure all the numbers are accurate and tied to one another. Note, it may be necessary to add rows for additional transactions or expenses and/or columns for additional funding sources. In this case, it will be necessary to copy or complete the formulas in the new rows or columns as they will not contain the formulas. Detailed instructions for all forms are contained in the RFR Workbook Instruction Manual. On the screenshots from September request for reimbursement, the totals circled in red on the reimbursement request form, year-to-date form, and transaction list source documentation form can be reconciled to each other. The RFR Workbook contains a training breakdown form. This form is used only when the request for reimbursement contains training expenditures. The form indicates the dates, location of training, staff, and type of expense associated with the training. In this instance, the August RFR seen in previous slides would have required the training breakdown form as part of the RFR. Another tab in the RFR workbook is the travel claim tab. Similar to the training breakdown form, the travel claim form is completed and becomes part of the RFR submission only when travel is part of the request for reimbursement. In this webinar, the July request would have required the completion and submission of this document. When submitting the travel claim form, you may submit backup documentation. For travel expenses, it is not necessary to submit maps and/or directions of travel. These may be kept on file in-house. For claims submitted electronically, please indicate signature on file on the signature line. The claim with the original signatures must be available for review during site visits. Please keep in mind to enable a timely payment, all reimbursement requests must contain the appropriate required documents at the time of submission. The last tab within the RFR workbook is the InKind contribution match form. The InKind contribution match form is used only for subgrant awards that have required match within their subgrant. In addition to this form, there is a brief section on the reimbursement request form for information currently being reported. Upon initial creation of the RFR workbook, populate the approved match budget column on the reimbursement request form, as well as the InKind contribution match form. For each monthly request for reimbursement, the InKind contribution match form will be updated to depict how much and in which category match was occurred. The subrecipient must also update the match column on the InKind contribution match form for each month. Expenses allocated to the match of the program must meet all the same requirements of an expense previously discussed: allowable, reasonable, within the budget period, allocable, which is the grant receiving a benefit, and cannot be used to match any other grant. Additionally, federal grant dollars cannot be used to match a subgrant that is funded with federal grant dollars. Backup documentation is required to accompany the InKind contribution match form. Detailed instructions for all forms are contained in the RFR Workbook Instruction Manual. Some final notes for this webinar include a reminder that all requests for reimbursement are due by the 15th of the month following the month the expenditure was incurred. Please ensure that all expenses submitted for reimbursement consideration are expenses that have been previously outlined in the subgrant award budget narrative and were incurred during the subgrant period dates. In the past, as a way to speed up the payment process, handwritten corrections have been included on the required documents and submitted to the accounting office for payment. The Grants Management Unit will no longer be able to handwrite corrections and will instead reject the request for reimbursement for subrecipient correction and resubmission. Please review in detail, reconcile each of the required forms to each other, and ensure appropriate supporting documents are included in the request so that payments can be processed timely. Again, complete and sign all required forms and email the packet and supporting documentation as needed to gmu@dhhs.nv.gov. If you have any questions or concerns regarding your specific subgrant and program, please reach out to your program manager. This concludes the webinar presentation for requests for reimbursement. We welcome any and all questions you may have regarding the material covered in this webinar. Please submit questions in written form to the GMU email at gmu@dhhs.nv.gov. The questions and handwritten answers, examples, requests for reimbursement, RFRs, and RFR Workbook Instruction Manual can be accessed via the link to Grants Management Unit website. Thank you all. We are excited and look forward to working with our state and community organizations.